So did Mistborn get me back into the genre? Well, if you look at the title of this video, you bet that shit did. Hi everybody, welcome to Between the Lines. My name's Julian, an obsessive reader and book collector, and today I'm talking about Mistborn. Specifically, how I kind of left fantasy for a little while, wasn't really reading it, and how the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson helped me get back into it. So this is going to be a spoiler-free video. I don't want to give anything away. It's going to be somewhat of a review meets a story. I'm going to talk about my history with the series and reading fantasy overall, and I want to talk a little bit about what worked for me and inspired me to keep reading fantasy after finishing the Mistborn trilogy. So let's get into it. So first off, let me give you a bit of a background as to how I kind of started reading fantasy and eventually left it. So as a kid, I was obsessed with the genre. I read everything that a lot of people my age read in their formative reading years, like Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, Aragon, The Hobbit. And that's pretty much all I read as a kid was fantasy. I didn't read much else from other genres, maybe a little bit of science fiction, but fantasy was my favorite genre growing up. And it wasn't until high school, when stuff like studies and football got in the way, that I stopped reading it. I think I might have actually only read one fantasy book in high school, which is really sad thinking back on it. I think it was book 4 of the Inherited Cycle, which is the final one in that series, and that's the only one I can remember reading. And it became even worse in university when I went away to school, and I thought I was being really cool by only forcing myself to read intellectual books like literature and philosophy books, stuff like that. I was just a pretentious d***. I wasn't actually intellectual. But over those years when I was away at school, I honestly didn't read any fantasy. I couldn't tell you a single fantasy book that I read during that time. I think I literally read 0. Which is sad, coming from a kid whose favorite genre was fantasy and that's all he would read, to start growing up and move away from it, which is something that a lot of people do. But in finishing school, I knew I wanted to kind of go back to my roots and read a bit of fantasy. So I reread Harry Potter, I read Lord of the Rings for the first time, which have since become my favorite books, and I think at that point too I'd started dabbling in A Song of Ice and Fire, but they were great, and while Lord of the Rings to me may be the greatest story ever told, I wasn't a fantasy reader. I wasn't back in the genre. I wasn't keeping up with what had come out since Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. I had somehow missed out that the entire Wheel of Time existed. And then a couple of years ago, we get to the point where I was in a bit of a writing mood, and I was watching writing videos on YouTube instead of actually writing, and I stumbled across Brandon Sanderson's lecture series. And these are super popular on the internet. If you're here watching this video, you've most likely heard of these videos or seen them. And I think his name had come up for me once or twice before in the past, but I had never read any of his books or really known what they were about. And when he started talking about Mistborn, I realized I'd actually heard the concept before. Somebody had explained to me that there are these fantasy books where if you ingested a metal, depending on the metal that you took in, would give you a different set of powers, and I thought, okay, that's cool. And when Brandon Sanderson was explaining his inspiration for the series and his initial concept for it, I was getting interested, and I said, okay, maybe I'll actually read them. But in going from those lecture series, that's where I actually discovered BookTube and channels like Daniel Green, where there was a lot of Cosmere, Brandon Sanderson content, which eventually led me here. But at the time, it made me really want to decide to get into fantasy, and I thought that the first book I should read would be The Final Empire, or as I bought it, later renamed as Mistborn. Sanderson said something in his lecture series when he was talking about Mistborn on how the first book could be its own complete story. You don't necessarily have to read the sequels, let alone the sequel series, to get a beginning to end complete story in the first book. If you want to continue, there's more to add to it. But something that I really liked knowing beforehand going into the series was that I'd get a complete story, maybe even in book 1, let alone the whole trilogy. And that was really comforting to know, having dabbled in A Song of Ice and Fire, to know that there was something complete here, that I could just ease myself back into the genre. The books weren't too long, and I knew I would get a complete story at the end of book 1 or book 3, depending on if I liked it. So I bought the first book, I read it in a week, and what did I think? Well, as the title of this video suggests, this got me back into fantasy. So if you don't know what Mistborn is about, it's essentially about a band of rebels and outsiders within this epic fantasy world that are trying to affect change under the rule of a tyrannical overlord, which isn't necessarily a very fresh or unique plot when it comes to fantasy, but the spin that the author takes on it is actually pretty unique, where he takes inspiration from the heist genre and infuses it with inspiration from things like My Fair Lady and gives that tired rebel trope a new spin. And this was my first experience in terms of books with what's called hard magic. The only thing that I had kind of encountered with this sort of magic was Avatar: The Last Airbender, and although I'm not opposed to softer magic systems, that's what I kind of grew up with, it was kind of really refreshing and new to me to encounter this in a fantasy series, and I really enjoyed it. Learning all the different rules and limitations was really fun, although it did take me longer than maybe I should have to finally memorize what metals did what. There were even points near the end of the third book where somebody would do something and I'd have to go to the reference page to see what that metal did. And the protagonist of this series is a girl named Vin, who has the capability to use this magic where you ingest metals, and depending on the metal that you take in, it gives you different power. And at the beginning of this series, she's an outsider. She has no idea what this magic is or the bigger scope about the world, what's going on in the world, who are the key players. And in both of us, the reader and Vin, being an outsider, it really helps us learn what's going on with this magic and the world building and all that. And I know this isn't something new when it comes to fantasy or storytelling in general, but I found in a story like this where the world was so fleshed out already and the magic had really hard stakes and limitations, it really helped to have somebody learning with you, so that there were no giant exposition dumps to characters that already knew what was going on and maybe making that section less engaging or a bit boring. In Vin learning that stuff about the magic in the world, we're learning it with her. And having finished book one, I thought, okay, this guy he's something. He's a really good writer. I think Brandon Sanderson may be the best plotter I've ever read. With the way these books are laid out, if you don't know the author, he's a rigorous outliner when it comes to his books. Everything is planned beforehand. Everything in this story meshes so well together and everything is so motivated that, to me, in reading these books, it felt like a Swiss watch where every little piece was functional and had a purpose and meant something that would affect something else. And it was so well done and so well crafted that I was honestly blown away with how well this guy crafted this book. He might be the master of payoffs. So many things that were buried early in the story would get paid off so well and hit so hard and be so earned later in the story, and stuff that was even planted at the very beginning of the series would still be affecting the end of the story at the end of book 3 and recontextualize the whole thing. And this doesn't only apply to things like Chekhov's guns where there's like an object or an idea buried. This comes to character arcs too, where character arcs or character decisions are very well set up. And I honestly haven't read many series in my life where the books maybe got better as they went along. Book 1 is very complete and well done and maybe has the most even pacing out of the 3, I think. But books 2 and 3, I can't decide which is my favorite. It really depends on the day and what mood I'm in. So book 2, The Will of Ascension, which may or may not be my favorite, maybe has the slowest pacing out of the 3. I think it's the biggest in the trilogy as well. Sanderson is maybe not notorious for this, but well known for his writing style where he really takes his time and really organically tries to set everything up at a very deliberate, slow pace at the beginning. I don't think that this is necessarily a flaw. I think he does this intentionally, but he will do that in order so that when things pay off towards the end of the books, they hit really hard and everything kind of hits you all at once like an avalanche. And book 2 was the biggest example of this, where it really took its time at the beginning, but the payoffs at the end were insane. This book might have the best third act I've read in a fantasy book. It was nuts. Everything hit so hard. And I don't want to give anything away about the ending of this book, but if you've read the ending of Well of Ascension, you know what I'm talking about. Holy shit. That book maybe also had my favorite character arc in the series. I won't say who it is, but there's a character who receives sort of an education where they start one way and they have to learn how to become a certain kind of person and learn more about their role in the world. And to see them start one way and end the way they do at the end of that book was really fun and maybe my favorite out of the series. And book 3, The Hero of Ages, was just crazy. I couldn't believe Sanderson managed to sustain that high stakes, intense, terrifying atmosphere throughout the entirety of that book. And without giving anything away, the ending of this book, and also the end of the series, transcended the series so much and kind of recontextualized so much for me, and I wasn't really expecting it to end the way it did. Maybe I should have after the way book 2 ended, but with that ending, it made the whole series better as a completed piece of work and lifted the whole series to another level for me. And when the series finished, I knew I wanted more. I had heard that there was a sequel series out there, although I have also heard that they're a little different from Mistborn Era 1. And although I wanted more, I knew I would need a break from this world, and I haven't read Era 2 as of now. I will definitely for sure. But in finishing that series, I knew I wanted more of something, and that thing was more fantasy. Since then, I've read the entire Witcher series, I've read The Dark Tower, I'm making my way through the Dresden Files and just finished book 11. And if you haven't seen my sci-fi fantasy TBR video, which you should, I explain the series that I want to read next. And there's a lot on there, first of which is The Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time is the next big fantasy series I'm gonna read. I think I'm gonna wait until I'm near the end of the Dresden Files or caught up to where the series is right now before I get into the Wheel of Time, because that's going to be such a huge undertaking. But I'm very excited to get into those, and I'm also really excited to see how Brandon Sanderson did with the final books in that series. I know he took over for Robert Jordan after he unfortunately passed away. I'm going to be interested to compare how Sanderson's writing maybe differs in that series versus the way it was in Mistborn. And if you're asking if I've read Stormlight, I haven't. And I would like to point you to this clip in my TBR where I explain why I'm not going to read Stormlight anytime soon. So these were on my TBR for a while, but in reading more fantasy, I've come to realize how massive these books actually are and that there's going to be 10 of them. And I don't really want to get started on them for a little bit. I really want to read stuff like Wheel of Time, Malazan first before I get into these. So I put them on the way back burner for a while. Also, my brother, who's a Stormlight fan, kept really annoying me about reading them. He would always get on me about starting The Way of Kings all the time. So to annoy him, I told him that I wouldn't read those books until I got to 10,000 subscribers, which may or may not happen. If it does, great. If it doesn't, oh well. But I guarantee you, if the day ever comes that I hit 10,000 subscribers, I will film myself going to the store, I will buy The Way of Kings, and I will start it that day. So am I a fantasy reader now? I think I am. Mistborn did something really crucial for me that not even Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings could do for me. Although Lord of the Rings is my favorite series of books, Mistborn introduced me to what modern fantasy can offer, and my reading hasn't been the same since. Let me know in the comments if you've read Mistborn. Did you enjoy it as much as I did? I shouldn't even bother asking that. Of course you did. Let me know if, like me, you spent some time away from fantasy, and if you ever came back to it, what was the book or series that helped you get back into the genre? Don't forget to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.